Chapter 25, The Triple Transformation. So I'd like to start from here. Apart from these confusions, born of an after-death contact with discarded phantasms or remnants of the sheets of the personality, the difficulty is due to our ignorance of the subliminal parts of our nature and the form and powers of the conscious being or Purusha, which preside over their action. Owing to this inexperience, we can easily mistake something of the inner mind or vital self for the psyche. For as being is one yet multiple, so also the same law prevails in ourselves and our members. The spirit, the Purusha, is one, but it adapts itself to the formations of nature. Over each grade of our being, a power of the spirit presides. We have within us and discover, when we go deep enough inwards, a mind self, a life self, a physical self. There is a being of mind, a mental Purusha, expressing something of itself on our surface in the thoughts, perceptions, activities of our mind, nature. A being of life which expresses something of itself in the impulses, feelings, sensations, desires, external life activities of our vital nature. A physical being, a being of the body, which expresses something of itself in the instincts, habits, formulated activities of our physical nature. So he says that besides the inner mind, inner vital, inner physical, and the psychic behind that, the psychic entity, there is also this being. Each part of ourselves has a Purusha that is attached to it, which is behind that. That is the witness self in each part. So the vital Purusha is the witness part of the vital being. The mental Purusha is the witness part of the mental being. The physical Purusha is the witness part of the physical being. So these three Purushas are there, and where do they reside? Over each grade of our being, a power of the spirit resides. So this is a power of the spirit. We have within us and discover, when we go deep enough inwards, a mind self, that is a mental Purusha, a life self, a vital Purusha, a physical self, which is the physical Purusha. So these three Purushas are a power of the spirit, which is the Purusha, the witness in each of these parts. And now these Purushas also influence our outer activities of the mind, the outer impulses, feelings, sensations, desires, and the outer physical being, the being of the body, which expresses something of itself in the instincts, habits, formulated activities of our physical nature. These beings, or part selves they're called, of the self in us are powers of the spirit. So these are powers of the spirit that are the Purushas in each part of our being. And therefore they are called part selves. These beings or part selves of the self in us are powers of the spirit, and therefore not limited by their temporary expression. For what is thus formulated is only a fragment of its possibilities. But the expression creates a temporary mental, vital, or physical personality which grows and develops even as the psychic being or soul personality grows and develops within us. So these Purushas also grow and develop, much like the psychic being grows and develops. Each has its own distinct nature. So each of these Purushas have their own distinct nature, their own influence, its own action on the whole of us. But on our surface, all these influences and all this action as they come up mingle and create an aggregate surface being which is a composite, an amalgam of them all, an outer, persistent, and yet shifting and mobile formation. But when it comes to the surface, these Purushas, when their action and their influence on the surface, it all gets mixed up. It becomes an amalgam, composite, an aggregate surface being. So these influences mingle up and create an aggregate surface or a composite, an amalgam of them all, an outer, persistent, and yet shifting and mobile formation for the purposes of this life and its limited experience. But This aggregate is, because of its composition, a heterogeneous compound, not a single harmonious and homogeneous whole. So because it's composed of the vital Purusha, the mental Purusha, the physical Purusha, it is not one whole, it is a heterogeneous compound of itself. This is the reason why there is a constant confusion and even a conflict in our members, which our mental reason and will are moved to control and harmonize, and have often much difficulty in creating out of their confusion or conflict some kind of order and guidance. Even so, ordinarily, we drift too much or are driven by the stream of our nature and act from whatever in it comes uppermost at the time and seizes the instruments of thought and action. Even our seemingly deliberate choice is more of an automatism than we imagine. Our coordination of our multifarious elements and of our consequent thoughts, feelings, impulses, actions by the reason and will is incomplete and a half measure. So, much as we imagine that we make deliberate choices, but actually, because this is a heterogeneous, different parts are all put together, come to the surface, get all mixed up and amalgamate. Different things seize our being. Sometimes we are moved by some passion, sometimes we are moved by some thought, and before we know it, we are not in control of what is moving us. We are pushed and pulled by these forces. So, even our seemingly deliberate choice is more of an automatism than we imagine. Our coordination of our multifarious elements and of our consequent thoughts, feelings, impulses, and actions by the reason and will is incomplete in a half measure. In animal being, nature acts by her own mental and vital intuitions. She works out an order by the compulsion of habit and instinct, which the animal implicitly obeys, so that the shiftings of its consciousness do not matter. So unlike animals who are far more consistent, human beings are not. You will see animal nature. When you see the nature of a dog like Monk, everything is very consistent about him. He works by instinct and intuition. So they do not have these, one day they're in this mood, second day they're in that mood. They are what they are, and they are very, very consistently their nature. They express themselves all the time true to their natures. Human beings do not. And this is the reason why. So, in animal being, nature acts by her own mental and vital intuitions. She works out an order by the compulsion of habit and instinct, which the animal implicitly obeys. So you see animals, when it's time for their feed, whether it's horses or any animals, they'll go at that time, they'll go and stand near their food every day because they're used to eating at that time. And when it's time to take them into their stables or inside, they'll go and stand near the gate because they know the man is going to come and take them inside their stables. If it's good weather and they know it's time for them to come out, and because every day they go out, and if somebody forgets to take them out at that time, delays it too long, they start stamping in the stable, creating a ruckus. That means, hello, we know we have to go out now. So they are creatures of habit, instinct, their nature, that all the elements of their nature, the way they behave, their response to flight to somebody who is gentle to them, their response to someone who is harsh to them, their response to someone who understands them is always the same. Unlike us, where our response can be 100 different things, depending on which part of our being comes forward. Okay? So, but man cannot altogether act in the same way without forfeiting his prerogative of manhood. He cannot leave his being to be a chaos of instincts and impulses, regulated by the automatism of nature. Mind has become conscious in him, and is therefore self-compelled to make some attempt, however elementary in many, to see and control, and in the end more and more perfectly harmonize the manifold components, the different and conflicting tendencies that seem to make up his surface being. He does succeed in setting up a sort of regulated chaos or ordered confusion in him, or at least succeeds in thinking that he is directing himself by his mind and will, even though in fact that direction is only partial. For not only a disparate consortium of habitual motive forces, but also newly emergent vital and physical tendencies and impulses, not only calculable or controllable, and many incoherent and inharmonious mental elements, use his reason and will, enter into and determine his self-building, his nature development, his life action. Man is in his self a unique person, but he's also, in his manifestation of self, a multi-person. He will never succeed in being master of himself until the person imposes, and the person is with the capital P. He will never succeed in being a master of himself until the person imposes itself on his multi-personality and governs it. But this can only be imperfectly done by the surface, mental will and reason. So this person who will govern, who imposes itself on his multi-personality, is only imperfectly done as long as man is under the control of his own mind. As long as you're using only your reason and your will, that control over the multitudinous multi-personality that we have, multiple personalities that we have, is not possible unless you are under the influence and control of who? P. P is for person, P is for psychic being. So, in being master of himself until the person imposes itself on his multi-personality and governs it. But this can only be imperfectly done by the surface mental will and reason. It can be perfectly done only if he goes within and finds whatever central being is by its predominant influence at the head of all his expression and action. In inmost truth, it is his soul that is this central being, but in outer fact, it is often one or other of the part beings in him that rules. And this representative of the soul, this deputy self, he can mistake for the inmost soul principle. This rule of different selves in us is at the root of the stages of the development of human personality, which we have already had occasion to differentiate. And we can reconsider them now from the point of view of the government of the nature by the inner principle. In some human beings, it is the physical Purusha, the being of the body, who dominates the mind, will, and actions. There is then created the physical man, mainly occupied with his corporeal life and habitual needs, impulses, life habits, mind habits, body habits, looking very little or not at all beyond that, subordinating and restricting all his other tendencies and possibilities to that narrow formation. So now, from here onwards, Sri Aurobindo is explaining that often we mistake these mental, vital, physical Purushas, the self, that part of our being that is for the psychic being. However, it is not the psychic being. But what happens is that one or the other of these Purushas tend to be more dominant in each of us. Each one of us is more either has a dominant vital Purusha or a dominant mental Purusha or a dominant physical Purusha. So now he's describing those that are, what kind of person is what. You understand? All are not dominated. All the Purushas are working together, and you could have a mixture of two Purushas more stronger than the third. Yeah, for example, those who have a very physical existence normally have physical vital. Those who have a mental existence have more mental vital. So those mixtures are there. In some human beings, it is the physical Purusha, the being of body, who dominates mind, will, and action. There is then created the physical man, mainly occupied with his corporeal life and habitual needs, impulses, life habits, mind habits. So this is the habitual man. This is the physical Purusha. Even in the mind, it is the physical mind that is most dominant. The mind habits of the mind. So if you get into a certain habit, even in the mind, it will keep going into that same habitual thought pattern. It can't get out of its own thought patterns. It gets stuck like a record wherever it goes. If it's in the mind, it'll get stuck in the mind, the physical man. If it's in the physical, but if his habits are good and pure and beautiful, he can lead a very harmonious life. You understand? So, habitual needs, impulses, life habits, mind habits, body habits, looking very little or not at all beyond that. You see people who have a very fixed routine, absolutely will follow that and, seem to be very, very disciplined and very harmonized in that. But they can't get out of those fixed ideas, fixed mental habits, fixed vital habits, fixed physical habits. And if you tell them to do something else, they get very disturbed. Eat some other kind of food, they can't do it. After 1 week of eating some other food, I can't eat this food. I can only eat what I am used to eating. That's a physical mind, physical vital mind. So the vital Purusha is strong, physical Purusha is strong when you have a very habitual nature. It likes to go by habit. Everything it does, it goes by that fixed habit, whether it's in the mind or the emotions or in the body. Okay? So But even in the physical man, there are other elements, and he cannot live altogether as the human animal, concerned with birth and death and procreation, and the satisfaction of common impulses and desires, and the maintenance of the life and the body. This is his normal type of personality, but it is crossed, however feebly, with influence which he can proceed if they are developed to a higher human evolution. So, if the inner subtle physical Purusha insists, he can arrive at the... So even in the physical man, there are two types of physical men. One that is governed by the outer nature, an outer being. The other that is governed by the inner subtle physical Purusha. Insists he can arrive at the idea of a finer, more beautiful and perfect physical life and hope, or attempt to realize it in his own or in the collective or group existence. In others, it is the vital self. So, have you understood? Anuradha, can you explain what Sri Aurobindo is saying here to everybody?
So when you're dominated by the physical consciousness, let's say, and then the nature of the body, the physical, is fixed habits. It goes by habits, and there is a fixity, there is a rigidity. So the same characteristics show up in your mind, your thought patterns, your relationships. In everything, there is this clinging on to habit, to the comfort zone, to the known, and So it also creates, the power is also a certain stability and discipline, but then there is also rigidity and a lack of growth. That is, so there he's saying, but even the people who are dominated by this, even in them, because they are not just physical, there are other strains also. So there might be, even if it is in a weak form, there is also a subtle physical. And if that comes to the fore, then because the subtle physical or the inner physical, that can create that always looks for larger things, for more refinement, etc. That's more fluid than the outer. So that can lead the person to create a more beautiful, finer, harmonious life. So that's the beauty of the power of the inner physical, the subtle physical.
So, and most of us confuse the psychic nature to these Purushas, but they are separate. They're different. So in others, it is the vital self, the being of life, who dominates and rules the mind, the will, the action. Then is created the vital man, concerned with self-affirmation, self-aggrandizement, life enlargement, satisfaction of ambition and passion and impulse and desire, the claims of his ego, domination, power, excitement, battle and struggle, inner and outer adventure. All else is incidental or subordinated to this movement and building and expression of the vital ego. But still, in the vital man too, there are or can be other elements of a growing mental or spiritual character, even if these happen to be less developed than his life personality and life power. The nature of the vital man is more active, stronger, and more mobile, more turbulent and chaotic, often to the point of being quite unregulated, that of the physical man who holds on to the soil and has a certain material poise and balance, but it is more kinetic and creative. So this sort of corresponds to the tamas, rajas and sattva, but not completely, but to some degree, yes. More often to the point of being quite unregulated than that of the physical man who holds on to the soil and has a certain material poise and balance, but it is more kinetic and creative, for the element of the vital being is not earth but air. It has more movement, less status. A vigorous vital mind and will can grasp and govern the kinetic vital energies, but it is more by the forceful compulsion and constraint than by a harmonization of the being. If, however, a strong vital personality, mind and will can get the reasoning intelligence to give it a firm support and be its minister, then a certain kind of forceful formation can be made, more or less balanced, but always powerful, successful and effective. which can impose itself on the nature and environment and arrive at a strong self-affirmation in life and action. This is the second step of harmonized formulation possible in the ascent of the nature. So, clear? At a higher stage of the evolution of personality, the being of mind may rule. So now you go from the physical to the mental to the vital. And what it's saying is that each of them has a lower status to it and a higher in each. The physical, when it's in its highest form, can be very harmonious and disciplined and blah blah, lead. And the vital, when it's in the highest form, governed by the reason and more subtilized, can also create a certain forcefulness and success and effectiveness. Then it goes to it at a higher stage of the evolution of personality. The being of mind may rule. There is then created the mental man, who lives predominantly in the mind as the others live in the vital or the physical nature. The mental man tends to subordinate to his mental self-expression, mental aims, mental interests, or to a mental idea or ideal the rest of his being, because of the difficulty of this subordination and its potent effect when achieved. It is at once more difficult for him and easier to arrive at a harmony of his nature. It is easier because the mental will, once in control, can convince by the power of the reasoning intelligence and at the same time dominate, compress, or suppress the life and the body and their demands, arrange and harmonize them, force them to be its instruments, even reduce them to a minimum so that they shall not disturb the mental life or pull it down from its ideative or idealizing movement. It is more difficult because life and body are the first powers, and if they are in the least strong, can impose themselves with an almost irresistible insistence on the mental ruler. Man is a mental being, and the mind is the leader of his life and body. But this is a leader who is much led by his followers and has sometimes no other will than what they impose on him. Mind, in spite of its power, is often impotent before the inconscient and subconscient, which obscure its clarity and carry it away on the tide of instinct or impulse. So mind, in spite of its power, is often impotent before the inconscient and subconscient, which obscure its clarity and carry it away either on a tide of instinct or impulse. In spite of its clarity, it is fooled by vital and emotional suggestions into giving sanction to ignorance and error. So the emotional being becomes very strong and can carry the mind away. However, the mind is the leader and the head of our being, because of the strong vital and emotional suggestions. It is fooled by vital and emotional suggestions into giving sanction to ignorance and error, to wrong thought and to wrong action. Or it is obliged to look on while the nature follows what it knows to be wrong. Sometimes, even though it knows that what it's doing is wrong, it is obliged to look on, is helpless, because the vital nature in us is so strong that it overtakes the mind. You understand? So sometimes you see that, when you get into a state of revolt or state of depression or state of anger, whatever it might be, it just completely overtakes you, doesn't it? So that is how it functions. Or it is obliged to look on while the nature follows what it knows to be wrong, dangerous, or evil, even when it is strong and clear and dominant. What is strong and clear and dominant? The mind. Though it imposes a considerable mentalized harmony, cannot integrate the whole being and nature. So what is Aurobindo saying here? He's saying, look, the first base of our whole foundation is the physical one, and then the vital one. These two are very strong in human nature. Even though human nature is governed by the mind and reason, when the vital and impulses get out of control, the mind even cannot do anything about it. So the mind can help, but it cannot harmonize, it's saying. The mind has its limitations. So mind, though it imposes a considerable mentalized harmony, cannot integrate the whole being and nature. So the mind is impotent for integration, cannot integrate the whole being. You understand? However much you try, your mind cannot integrate the different parts of your being. These harmonizations by an inferior control are, besides, inconclusive, because it is one part of the nature which dominates and fulfills itself, while the others are coerced and denied their fullness. They can be steps on the way, but not final. Therefore, in most men, there is no such sole dominance and effected partial harmony, but only a predominance, and for the rest, an unstable equilibrium of a personality, half formed, half in formation, sometimes a disequilibrium or unbalance due to the lack of a central government or the disturbance of a formally achieved partial poise. So, therefore, because of this, there is no one thing can dominate. The mind is not ever in full dominance. The vital is never, it is always something or the other that keeps jumping up. Have you understood that or no? Let me read that again. These harmonizations by an inferior control of the mind are besides inconclusive because it is one part of the nature which dominates and fulfills itself while the others are coerced and denied their fullness. They can be steps on the way but not final. Therefore, in most men, there is no such sole dominance and effected partial harmony, but only a predominance, and for the rest an unstable equilibrium of a personality half formed, half in formation, sometimes a disequilibrium or unbalance due to the lack of a central government or the disturbance of a formally achieved partial poise. All must be transitional until a first, though not a final, true harmonization is achieved by finding our real center. So here Sri Aurobindo is clearly putting it across that the mind is not the real center of the being. And the mind, with all its reasoning power and will, cannot harmonize and integrate the different parts of our personality and nature. Something deeper and higher needs to come forward if we have to integrate our different parts. And that is done by finding our real center. For the true central being is the soul. But this being stands back and in most human natures is only the secret witness, or one might say, a constitutional ruler who allows his ministers to rule for him. So he's like the President of India, who allows everybody else to rule for him. So this inner being or soul or secret witness is like a constitutional ruler who allows his ministers. Who are the ministers in us? The vital being, the mental being, the physical being. Yeah, outer and inner. So they allows all its ministers, different ministers, to rule for him. Delegates to them his empire. Gives away, abdicates and delegates. Says, okay, you take over. Delegates to them his empire, silently assents to their decisions, and only now and then puts in a word which they can at any moment override and act otherwise. This sounds just like the President of India. He gives an advice, a suggestion, and it is mostly overruled. Sometimes it is followed. So this is our secret being is like a constitutional ruler. Okay, so a constitutional ruler who allows his ministers to rule for him, delegates to them his empire, silently assents to their decisions, and only now and then puts in a word which they can at any moment override and act otherwise. But this is so long as the soul personality put forward by the psychic entity. Now, please see the difference, the distinction between the soul personality, which you didn't realize what it was, and the psychic entity. The personality has within it the inner being, the inner mind, the inner vital, and the inner physical. Yes, continue to read. But this is so long as the soul personality put forward by the psychic entity. The psychic entity puts forward a soul personality is not yet sufficiently developed. When this is strong enough for the inner entity to impose itself through it. So when this soul personality becomes strong enough for this inner entity to impose itself through it, then the soul can come forward and control the nature. So this is the difference between the psychic being and the psychic entity or the psychic's principle. Then the soul can come forward and control the nature. It is by the coming forward of this true monarch. Who is the true monarch? It is the coming forward of this true monarch and his taking up of the reins of government that there can take place a real harmonization of our being and our life. Okay? So the psychic entity pushes and develops the soul personality. You see? And this soul personality, when this comes forward, then becomes the true monarch and takes up the reins of government And that's a soul personality is the same term. It's a synonym of psychic being. You understand? Okay. He takes up the reins of the government that there can take place a real harmonization of our being and our life. A first condition of the soul's complete emergence is a direct contact in the surface being with the spiritual reality. Because it comes from that, the psychic element in us turns always towards whatever in phenomenal nature seems to belong to a higher reality and can be accepted as its sign and character. So, a first condition of the soul's complete emergence is a direct contact in the surface being with the spiritual reality. Because it comes from that, what comes from? Because the soul comes from that spiritual reality, the psychic element in us turns always towards whatever in phenomenal nature, in outer nature, seems to belong to a higher reality and can be accepted as its sign and character. At first, it seeks this reality through the good, the true, the beautiful. So how does it seek this reality? At first, it seeks this reality. Who's it here? The soul personality. The soul personality, the psychic being, that soul personality in us, it seeks this higher reality through whatever is good, true, and beautiful. So anything that is good, true, and beautiful develops the soul personality in us, develops the psychic nature in us, develops the psychic being in us. Therefore, when you read the Mother, the 4 austerities and the 4 liberations, you must connect up everything in your minds and in your consciousness so that it's not in separate books and pages. When you read that, what is it happening there? In that, the whole discipline is about developing beauty in the thoughts, beauty in the body through flexibility, suppleness, and health, beauty in the mind through good thoughts, through emotional beauty. How do you develop emotional beauty? Nobility, allowing nothing that is of a depraved, low nature in your feelings to come. No hatred, no rancor, no jealousy, no envy, no whatever. All the things that go against the true, good and beautiful. So that the 4 austerities is the discipline of developing the true, the good and the beautiful. So this is the mantra of life. And those that consciously develop these, they are developing their psychic personality. And here Sri Aurobindo says that is the first condition, the development of the true, good and beautiful, of the soul's emergence out. Yeah, Satyam Shivam Sundaram. But, so a first condition of the soul's complete emergence is a direct contact in the surface being with the spiritual reality. At first it seeks this reality through the good, the true, the beautiful, through all that is pure and fine and high and noble. But although this touch, through outer signs and characters, can modify and prepare the nature, it cannot entirely or most inwardly and profoundly change it. So this is a very good preparation of the nature. However, it cannot change it completely. And it cannot profoundly change it. It can prepare it, but stops short of changing it. What can change it? Let's read. For such an inmost change, the direct contact with the reality itself is indispensable, since nothing else can so deeply touch the foundations of our being and stir it or cast the nature by its stir into a ferment of transmutation. So the only thing that can change it completely, the profound change, is the direct contact with the reality itself. Now, what is this direct contact with the reality? It's the direct contact with the divine presence in us, or above us, or around us. So when this is what happens to you when you go to the Samadhi in Pondicherry, it cannot entirely or most inwardly and profoundly change it. For such an inmost change, the direct contact with the reality itself is indispensable, since nothing else can so deeply touch the foundations of our being and stir it or cast the nature by its stir into a ferment of transmutation. Mental representations, emotional and dynamic figures have their use and value. Truths, good and beauty are in themselves primary and potent figures of the reality. Okay? They're primary and potent figures of the reality with a capital R. And even in their forms as seen by the mind, as felt by the heart, as realized in the life, can be lines of an ascent. But it is in a spiritual substance and being of them and of itself that which they represent has to come into our experience. So that is the divine presence, what he's talking about here. So unless you are in contact with the divinity, the divine presence in your heart, the psychic being, the psychic entity, and you're in touch with the spiritual divine in the above, in the center of being, through that movement or through this movement, or you have the mother's grace and the mother's love and the mother's profound force that permeates your entire being, then you can change. Until then, you cannot change. That profound change cannot take place. Okay? The soul may attempt to achieve this contact, mainly through the thinking mind as an intermediary and instrument. It puts a psychic impression on the intellect and the larger mind of insight and intuitional intelligence and turns them in that direction. At its highest, the thinking mind is drawn always towards the impersonal. In its search, it becomes conscious of a spiritual essence. So the soul may attempt this through the mind. I told you, ascent of consciousness, through the mind. The mind can fix on this impersonality, this divinity, this spiritual consciousness, okay? So, in its search, it becomes conscious of a spiritual essence, an impersonal reality, which expresses itself in all these outward signs and characters, but is more than any formation or manifesting figure. It feels something of which it becomes intimately and invisibly aware, a supreme truth, a supreme good, a supreme beauty, a supreme purity, a supreme bliss. It bears the increasing touch, less and less impalpable and abstract, and more spiritually real and concrete, the touch and pressure of an eternity and infinity, which is all this that is and more. There is a pressure from this impersonality that seeks to mold the whole mind into a form of itself. At the same time, the impersonal secret and law of things becomes more and more visible. The mind develops into the mind of the sage, at first the high mental thinker, then the spiritual sage who has gone beyond the abstractions of thought to the beginnings of a direct experience. As a result, the mind becomes pure, large, tranquil, impersonal. There is a similar tranquilizing influence on the parts of life, but otherwise the result may remain incomplete. For the mental change leads more naturally towards an inner status and an outer quietude. But poised in this purifying quietism, not drawn like the vital parts towards the discovery of new life energies, does not press for a full dynamic effect on the nature. So, unless the vital is also calm, quieted, and harmonized, and sublimated, and again joins with mental aspiration and the mental status of peace, purity, and quietude. Until then, the full dynamic effect does not come into the nature. So, a higher endeavor through the mind does not change this balance. For the tendency of the spiritualized mind is to go on upwards. And since above itself, the mind loses its hold on forms, it is into a vast, formless and featureless impersonality that it enters. So through the mind, you can go into the samadhi or the nirvanic experience of shunya, But so the mind, when it goes to its highest reaches, gets lost into impersonality. It does not change the vital dynamic parts. Just through the mind you cannot do it. The life has to change, something else has to happen. That is what Sri Aurobindo says. But it is important to be able to get that wideness of mind, that largeness of this is an important step. You cannot do away with it, what he's saying. He's saying, but it is not complete in itself. Only to have that, you will enter into some sort of samadhi, experience of great impersonality, of mental silence, of quietude, of, like he says, the mind of the sage. But when you come down into your life parts, when you interact with people, when you leave that state of samadhi, or shunya, or nirvana, or whatever you want to call it, when you come down, and you have to deal with ordinary life, then your vital parts are not purified. So, for that he continues and explains what to do. So, it becomes aware of the unchanging self, the sheer spirit, the pure bareness of an essential existence. This is a very important experience though. Without it, you cannot have the change of nature. It becomes aware of the unchanging self, the sheer spirit, the pure bareness of essential existence, the formless infinite, and the nameless absolute. This culmination can be arrived at more directly by tending immediately beyond all forms and figures, beyond all ideas of good or evil, or true or false, or beautiful or unbeautiful, to that which exceeds all dualities, to the experience of a supreme oneness, infinity, eternity, or other ineffable sublimation of the mind's ultimate and extreme percept of self or spirit. A spiritualized consciousness is achieved. This is the second triple transformation. From the psychic, the spiritualized consciousness is achieved. So that's why Sri Aurobindo says, my yoga begins where all yogas end. But you have to first experience this. You can't jump the stage. So the spiritualized consciousness is the second stage of transformation. Okay? So what is, in simple words, what Sri Aurobindo here is saying is that our outer nature can be prepared by the love for beauty, for the truth, and for goodness. For it can be prepared through all that. The psychic preparation can take place. The psychic being can come forward for this. But however, for the true transformation, for the true change of our nature, we also need, the mind needs to experience the formless, the infinite, the eternal, and widen itself and become one with the entire universe. For that, a spiritual consciousness needs to be developed. So the mind has to also begin to rise in its consciousness to the higher reaches of mind, not from the ordinary mind, from the physical mind, to the mental mind, to the reasoning mind, then to go into a higher intuitive mind, from there go into the higher spiritual mind. The spiritualized mind actually is what brings quietness, calmness, and poise in the nature. It enlarges and widens your nature, your entire being, which the other first part, which is the psychic, coming forward of the psychic and the development of the psychic, alone cannot do. So the spiritual ascension of consciousness is also required. The mind also needs to get out of its mental trap. Okay? The way it's going to do that is through the becoming one with the eternal, to experience the infiniteness of all things, and to get that experience of quietness and silence in the mind. That's very important. So he's explaining that now. Is that clear? This culmination can be arrived at more directly by tending immediately beyond all forms and figures, beyond all ideas of good or evil or true or false, or beautiful or unbeautiful, to that which exceeds all dualities, to the experience of a supreme oneness, infinity, eternity, or other ineffable sublimation of the mind's ultimate and extreme perceptive self or spirit. A spiritualized consciousness is achieved, and the life falls quiet. The body ceases to need and to clamor. The soul itself merges into the spiritual silence. But this transformation through the mind does not give us the integral transformation. Psychic transmutation is replaced by a spiritual change on the rare and high summits. But this is not the complete divine dynamization of nature. So, now, even the spiritual consciousness that Sri Aurobindo is talking about here, he's saying that while the spiritual consciousness can give you the wideness and the silence, it is not enough for the integral transformation that he is working. That experience is important, but one can also reach it through another way, another path. Sorry?
I understand it a little differently.
You do? Okay. So why don't you explain what you understand? Maybe.
The matter is the same. The context I understand. Triple transformation. He's talking at this time, I feel, about the psychic, the first, not the spiritual.
No, he's not talking about the spiritual.
And when he says that we have to experience the reality directly, without that no final change can come, then he's saying the soul may try. This is one of the methods it might try.
Might try.
This is not the spiritual transformation he's talking.
No, that's true. It's not the spiritual. He comes to it later.
Yeah, right.
Correct.
So this is, here of course it's incomplete.
Incomplete.
It's only the mind.
The mind that goes.
on
Yeah.
the vital.
Yeah. So he says the spiritual is when all of them come together. Now he talks about
His spiritual transformation would obviously be the second transformation.
would be the
different.
no, it's not this. So he says this is incomplete. It will not take you to the integral transformation. Yeah, this method, Jnana Yogic method. But this experience is necessary. That's all I'm saying. But how you get this experience, you can get it from another way also. Okay, we'll stop here. So we will read this next time.